Christmas Eve, 1005. Light snow falls on the Blue Ridge Mountains. Behind heavy iron gates stands something that should not exist here. 250 rooms. In a landscape that hardly anyone knew. A house is not the right word for it. The driveway winds for several kilometers through forest and hills. Those who arrived back then saw the building only at the last moment, and that was entirely intentional. The building is called Biltmore Estate, built by George Washington Vanderbilt II. Not in New York, not in Newport, but in the mountains of North Carolina, far from everything the Vanderbilts had built before. The question is not how large it is. The question is why it stands there, and why someone who could have had everything chose exactly this. Because size alone does not explain it. It does not explain the location, and not the decision to distance himself from everything familiar. George Vanderbilt was born in 1862 on Staten Island. He was the youngest of 8 children. When his father died in 1885, he left behind a fortune of around $200 million. The largest share was divided between the 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William K. They built palaces in New York and Newport, competed publicly for influence, scale, visibility. George inherited $7 million. For his brothers, wealth was an instrument. For George, it was a precondition for a vision. He did not build an empire with it. He bought land in North Carolina, hired a forester, and began restoring an exhausted forest. While his brothers represented, he withdrew. He read systematically in 8 languages: English, French, German, Italian, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Sanskrit. He traveled through Europe, studied architecture, visited libraries, bought paintings and rare books. Friends described him as quiet, almost unremarkable. In company, he rarely stood out. From the age of 12, he kept a notebook. Title, author, date, every book he had ever read. When he died, the last entry was number 3, 159. He was interested in agriculture, in forestry, in the idea that land could not merely be owned, but managed. What drove him was not ambition in the conventional sense. It was more a question, how does one live well? He did not travel as a tourist. He traveled as a learner. In Paris, he visited studios and exhibitions. In Italy, he studied villas and gardens of the 16th century, how they were laid out, how they functioned, how they survived. In England, it was not society that interested him, but the country estates. He did not buy books to own them. He bought them to read them, and he truly did read them. What interested him everywhere was the same question: how does one create a place that truly works? In 1888, George traveled with his mother to Asheville. The family came for medical reasons. The mountain air was considered restorative. Asheville was a small town at the time. No society, no glamour, no season. The journey took days. That alone made the place feel different. He was not looking for an estate. He was not looking for status. He saw possibility where others saw only wasteland. The journey took days. That alone made the place feel different. But George saw something else. Mist over the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Forests stretching across hills and valleys as far as the eye could see. And land. A great deal of land. Land that no one wanted. The soil had been exhausted by decades of uncontrolled logging. Farms had been abandoned. Families had moved away. It was a place without a future. That was precisely what interested him. Others saw wasteland. George saw a project he began to buy. Without fanfare, without grand announcements, parcel by parcel over several years. In the end, he owned over 125,000 acres, roughly 500 square kilometers. He hired Gifford Pinchot, one of the first professional foresters in America. It became the first scientifically managed forestry project on American soil. He did not want a summer house. He wanted to show that exhausted land could grow again. For the house, George turned to Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was the most prominent architect of his generation. He had designed the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. For the landscape, he engaged Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who had designed Central Park. Both understood immediately that this was no ordinary commission. George presented Hunt with a clear vision, a French chateau, Loire style, but not an imitation, something of its own. He did not want a symbol. He wanted a place. Hunt designed a building with 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and a library, 2 stories high, 16 by 22 meters, built to hold 10,000 volumes. Construction began in 1889. On-site, a dedicated brickworks was established first, 32,000 bricks per day, along with a carpentry workshop. Limestone came from Indiana, nearly 10 million pounds of it, marble from Italy, tiles from Spain. A private railway line 3 miles long brought materials into the mountains. The construction site became a small city of its own. Over 1,000 workers were on site simultaneously. Stonemasons, gilders, carpenters, glaziers from across America and Europe. Inside, George installed everything the technology of his time allowed: electric light, elevators, central heating, hot water, a heated indoor pool, a bowling alley. His brothers built for guests, for society, for status. George built for himself, for a life he had imagined. On December 24, 1895, Biltmore opened its doors for the first time. The guests came from New York, people who knew grand houses, but not this. The entrance hall 7 stories high. The dining room seating 64 beneath a vaulted ceiling fresco. The library with 10 zazen volumes, selected, ordered, read. On the ceiling, an 18th century Venetian painting, shipped in 13 sections and reassembled on site. Many of the guests later spoke less about the scale than about the stillness, about the sense that everything had been planned, down to the smallest detail. Nothing felt accidental. George was 33 years old. He had gotten what he wanted: a place for books, for art, for conversation, for landscape, a place that was his, and that worked. For a moment, it seemed as though he had found exactly the right scale. In 1914, George Vanderbilt died in Washington, D.C. He was 51 years old. The cause was appendicitis, sudden, unforeseen. The news came without warning, and suddenly everything was open. Biltmore cost more than it could ever generate. The annual maintenance was enormous. Taxes rose, the fortune smaller than it appeared. He left his wife Edith an estate that was barely sustainable, and a daughter, Cornelia, 14 years old at the time, and a system that only worked as long as he was there, and a question he could no longer answer: what now? Edith tried to hold the estate together. She sold parts of the land. Over 80 Savizzano acres went to the state. From this, the Pisgah National Forest was later created. Cornelia married the English diplomat John Cecil in 1924. They opened Biltmore to paying visitors, one of the first private houses in America to do so, 1930, in the middle of the Depression. It was not an elegant conclusion. It was a decision to carry on. His brothers left behind fortunes. George left behind a forest, a library, and a house that barely anyone could hold. Or so it seemed at the time. A house too large for its era, too costly for reality, and too personal to simply let go. Whether it was possible to carry on, that he did not live to find out.